And then, of course, you have, I think, really a vastly underserved population of companies that's really small companies who, quite frankly, if they address security at all, are often really heavily reliant or entirely reliant on external vendors to do that or help them with that, right? So these vendors really provide all of the kind of preventative sorts of controls that hopefully prevent an incident from happening in the first place.
You're listening to KBcast, the cybersecurity podcast for all executives. Cutting through the jargon and hype to understand the landscape where risk and technology meet. Now, here's your host, Carissa Breen.
Ted, welcome to the show. How are you going today?
I'm doing well. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks for joining me. I think it's going to be a bit of an interesting chat today to talk a little bit more about your background, get a little bit more into the mind of what you're sort of seeing in the digital forensic space. But before we jump into that, we always like to start our conversation off talking about you and your journey. So please talk to us about where you sort of started and what are you sort of doing now?
Sure. So I kind of think of myself as someone who sort of snuck into the cybersecurity industry through an unlocked screen door on the back porch or something like that. After university, I actually started out in law enforcement. I had planned to really go into a federal agency, the FBI, U.S. Secret Service, something of that nature. But I kind of went through the application process for the Seattle Police Department sort of on a whim, kind of just to get a sense of what the process was like to hire on to a law enforcement agency. And so I went through that process, got offered a job, and it was kind of a bird in the hand, worth two in the bush sort of situation. So I signed up. I've always been a geek, like even as a kid. I guess my first real kind of computer was a Commodore PET with 8K of RAM in it back in the late 70s. So when I became a detective in the mid 90s, I was assigned to the crime analysis section where I wrote some custom scripts and software really to pull data from various disparate systems and parse the data, do analysis looking for patterns and linkages and so on. So anyway, I was offered the opportunity. I guess, they're like, okay, well, you can spell NT, you can spell Unix. So I was offered the opportunity to go to computer forensics training. And so I took them up on that. And there was a small group of investigators at my agency and at others that were doing digital forensics kind of before it was cool, right? So back then, they didn't have dedicated standalone forensic tools like NCASE or Expert Witness or FTK or Cellbrite or anything like that. So either you were using sort of standard data recovery types of tools, or you had to write tools yourself. Then I got moved to another division within the police department where I was helping to design an intelligence analysis system to do things like link analysis around really large, complex investigations. So I was doing database work and some development, and but also handling a regular caseload as a detective. So it's kind of a weird time in my life. But well, security became a big issue for me because I was suddenly the custodian of information that could literally lead to people getting killed, right? So I started going to things like Black Hat and SANS and DEF CON and so on. And I started attending and occasionally speaking at local meetings of industry groups like ISACA and ISSA and so on. I got my CISSP. And eventually I got recruited away from law enforcement by one of the big four accounting firms, or I guess at that time it was one of the big five accounting firms, into their information risk management practice. And I started doing things like network pen testing and application reviews and other types of things like that, and just general security consulting. And then really over the past 20 plus years, I've worked at a variety of deeply technical consultancies of various sizes and run teams doing pen tests and code reviews and application reviews and all kinds of stuff for public and private sector organizations, and really enjoyed all of it. So that's me.
Wow, that's awesome. I actually had another guy I interviewed on here from the US as well. He was in the FBI for 20 years, but he was saying it takes like, I don't know, years and years and years to sort of get into the FBI. And he said he just kept calling up, and eventually they were like, yeah, okay, we'll just put your application ahead of everyone else's because you just keep calling up. Is that true?
I mean, at the time, I hadn't really started the application process for the FBI, but it certainly is quite selective. Um, and so, yeah, that doesn't surprise me at all.
Yeah, absolutely. I just found that so interesting because I straight away, I mean, as an Australian, a lot of the shows around, criminal investigation. Do you think of Law and Order? Is it anything like that in the real world, or not really?
Well, there's certainly a lot less paperwork on the shows, right? There's they don't show the dozens and or hundreds of hours of documenting things, so that you have cases that are ready for court. Um, and there are other things in those police procedural types of shows. I think they don't, and rightly so. They don't really capture how horrific some of the crime scenes actually are.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, I don't know. I don't think I have a strong stomach for that stuff. It makes me feel a bit sick actually when I'm watching some of those shows. So you've got a really really interesting background because I mean, you've had all of these different experiences, different jobs, different divisions as well. Would you say because of that, that's really brought quite a unique perspective to what you're doing now? Because I mean, I worked in a bank and I used to do a lot of the reporting for the bank and the security division. And I remember going to the forensics team and getting their sort of updates. And so they had come from a traditional banking background, some of the people that I was dealing with. And so I'm really keen because you've had sort of that diverse experience. And do you believe because of that, you have this unique view around digital forensics and how people are talking about it and reporting about it, which we'll get into in a second. But I'm just keen to hear your thoughts because, again, you've seen things from all sides of the coin.
Yeah, I guess the things that I learned from my sort of real professional investigative career was really around the proper ways of structuring your narrative, structuring your report in a way that it's really suitable for use in court, right, or suitable for use in presenting the facts to a jury. Um, you know, One of the key things too is that I actually don't like going to court. I don't like testifying in court and so on, or waiting around to testify in court. And fortunately, I think as a detective, I didn't have to go to court very often because I'd like to think that I wrote really good reports and they were detailed and they were written in a way that was easily usable by the prosecution. I didn't have to appear and and testify about clarifying some points that perhaps I didn't elucidate in the report correctly. And so I think that has translated over really well to the private sector in terms of being able to create reports, create various kinds of deliverables, and so on, having a notion or thinking ahead about how they're going to be used. Right? Um, I like to say that when I was a detective or when I was a police officer, you had to consider that when you were writing a report, that it could be years before that actually goes to court, depending on if the person's in custody or if it takes a while to find your suspect and arrest them and that kind of thing. So it could be years before that actually gets to court, and you need to paint the picture of all of the facts and how you arrived at various conclusions and so on in order to make an arrest or whatever. Uh, in a way that they're going to paint the picture well 2 years from now, right? And more importantly, that you write clearly in a way that is going to present the facts appropriately to 12 members of a jury who weren't there at the crime scene or at the arrest or whatever. 2 or 3 years ago, And so really, I've kind of always approached my technical writing in that way, under trying to think about what the intended purpose is of the final product, and making sure that all of the appropriate information gets captured in the right way and presented in the right way.
Wow, that's super interesting. Yeah, taking years. Wow, you're absolutely right. Before we jump into that, why didn't you like going to court? Was it sort of the waiting around that you didn't like, or you didn't like having to speak in front of the jury and do all those types of things, or?
Oh yeah, I mean, there's a lot of waiting around. There's a lot of waiting around to testify. You could get a subpoena for a particular day to appear, and you show up, and it ends up being 2 or 3 days of waiting around to testify, right? And then, I mean, sometimes sparring with defense was interesting, but often I just didn't really care for that kind of adversarial sort of thing. But yeah.
Yeah, I totally can understand. So in terms of the reporting, one of the interesting points that you raised were you have to write reports probably with the intention of it being in perpetuity, right? If it's going to take years, sometimes you're probably not going to remember all the facts and everything that happened, especially when other people are reading it and looking at it for evidence and going through it like with a fine tooth comb. So let's jump into this side of things, because let's probably talk about your experience in writing these reports, and then let's sort of apply this to the security space, because I mean, I've looked at some of these reports before and they are quite detailed. And I think that perhaps using a lot of that detail is not always relevant for people that need to perhaps sort of communicate that up the chain. And I know that we're going to speak about that in a second, but I'm keen to just get your thoughts from what you've done traditionally and then how we can apply that in the security space today.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, looking at the law enforcement side of things, going back, uh, writing a report with all of the detail around what you did as part of your investigative process, um, detailing how you collected the evidence, how you processed it, how you analyzed it, and then painting the picture of how you arrived at certain logical conclusions based on your analysis. That's really critical. But you also need to be able to summarize all of that in a way that's easily digestible for different types of people who are going to use your reports, right? So um, that's a really important point to keep in mind in the private sector as well, where we're dealing with reports that may find themselves as part of a civil case, maybe a couple of years from now. And at the beginning, nobody knows that this is going to actually be part of a lawsuit from either direction, whether your company is doing the suing of somebody or your company is getting sued. And so you have to sort of think ahead and think as you're creating your deliverables for your investigation, that you need to do it in a way that you're obviously being very professional and diligent and capturing all the appropriate information, but then also thinking about what the potential downstream processes are going to be that rely on that document you're creating, right? And making sure that it's created and formatted and packaged in a particular way.
Absolutely, and I totally agree with you. So, from your point of view, coming from your background, doing this today, what are you sort of seeing in the market when it comes to this type of stuff? Like, as I alluded to before, I've seen a lot of the documents. They are quite long, they are quite detailed, and sometimes I think that it's a bit of analysis paralysis. I mean, I don't know specifically, but my hypothesis would be that people get lost in a lot of that stuff. So, and I think that happens across the board with any sort of thing in security, to be really honest. So, I'm keen to get your thoughts on what you're sort of seeing. And then off the back of that, like, where do you think like people can improve? Because you've got this experience, you know what it's like to construct a really good report. And I'm keen to just really hear how would you go about this for people who are listening?
Sure, sure. Well, I think what I have seen really varies based on the size of the organization or on the type of the organization, and its maturity level and so on. I think that at one end of the spectrum, at companies that are really large and sophisticated and mature, perhaps like the banks that you worked at, right? Companies that are large and sophisticated enough that they can actually have their own incident response teams and their own well-defined incident response processes. They're pretty good at doing things like carrying out the initial triage and doing threat hunting and carrying out the actual investigations internally and so on. And they have sort of the advantage of having the internal understanding of the organization to effectively tailor their reports, their output, and their communications to senior management and other kinds of key stakeholders in a way that's really effective for that organization. You have other organizations or companies that are kind of mid-sized companies that may have to rely heavily on external vendors, right? They outsource a lot of their security processes to manage security services providers, MSSPs. So think like maybe SecureWorks or Alert Logic, those kinds of places, and they either outsource some aspects of monitoring to them or all aspects of monitoring to them, which can be helpful, right? Because those kinds of providers can give that company 24/7 sort of coverage if they don't have the staffing levels to be able to do it themselves. Or they might outsource forensic analysis and incident response specifically to forensic experts, teams like think FireEye or Kroll or NCC Group, and service providers who can kind of drop parachute in some forensic experts into your environment in the event of a breach or an incident, something like that. Well, or they might have maybe a hybrid approach where you've got like internal teams that are performing some monitoring, and that there's kind of a split in the function of monitoring, sort of either horizontally or vertically with some external provider. And the internal team might be responsible for doing investigation or response for certain systems or certain parts of the infrastructure that are kind of considered their scope, right? And that when an incident happens, particularly if it's obviously like crossed that sort of boundary between what internal and external looks at, then your challenge is really coordinating that communication, coordinating the evidence collection and analysis and your recovery efforts and all of that, as well as, of course, doing the reporting. And so a lot of times you end up with a reporting process that's really disjointed, right? And your external parties, they might not understand the appropriate structure or content that your organization kind of prefers to have that output be really useful to them. And then, of course, you have, I think, really a vastly underserved population of companies that's really small companies who, quite frankly, if they address security at all, are often really heavily reliant or entirely reliant on external vendors to do that or help them with that, right? So these vendors really provide all of the kind of preventative sorts of controls that hopefully prevent an incident from happening in the first place. But also they're outsourcing the ability to detect some kind of incident and then to ultimately respond to that. And so those companies, these really small companies, they probably don't have the in-house expertise to really select the right set of services that they need from a security perspective, or they don't have the funding to really buy a tailored set of services from that provider or a set of providers. So the coverage and the deliverables that they typically get from those vendors, I think, tends to be fairly canned, right? And it's difficult for them to digest. It's difficult for those smaller companies to really derive a lot of value from them. But across all of those spectrums, other than like the really large companies who can run their own internal teams, I think that it's really easy to get overwhelming, overly technical reports, right, coming out of investigative processes or events.
Absolutely, and I know because I used to be that person that wrote reports, and I can understand when you're presenting something to someone who then has to present to someone else. You need to give them the cliff notes. These are the main things you got to speak about. So you have to go through like a chain of command on these are all the points that need to be communicated. And probably by the time it gets to the end person, it's changed or it's Chinese whispers or whatever it is. And I think that, would you say, from what you've said, you spoke about the content being disjointed and super technical, super jargony. Would you say from your experience that most executives feel incredibly overwhelmed when they're getting a digital forensics report? They have to then give an update to their CEO or whoever internally. How do you think they respond to that? And do you believe, because it is so technical and detailed, a lot of the key points completely aren't conveyed at all?
Sure. Yeah. I certainly, you've got overwhelm coming at executives if you drop a standard sort of detailed forensic report on their desk, right? I mean, if you hand an executive, a 30, a 40, 50 or more page detailed technical report, they're going to look at the first page, hopefully hoping that there's an executive summary there of the key 3 to 5 points that they need to know, right? And they're probably going to look at the last page before any appendices or whatever for some set of conclusions or observations or recommendations on what to do next, right? But the middle of it, if they try to read it, they're going to be overwhelmed by it. I mean, I think that generally when people go into technology as a field or they go into cybersecurity, they do it because they love kind of the geekiness of it, right? They love really diving into the deep technical details of systems and how they operate and so on. And it's super easy, I think, to kind of fall into the trap of seeing technology or seeing security as sort of ends unto themselves. And it's easy to sort of forget that, at least in the context of where you work, the technology is really there to support critical business processes and the operations of your organization, right? And security is really there to support those business operations in a safe way that preserves confidentiality, integrity, availability, and so on. But it's not about the technicality of it once you start having to report to executives. I mean, I once had somebody say, you're technically correct, the most annoying kind of correct, right? It's really easy to sort of fall down that hole of trying to make sure that you're technically correct. But if you're not communicating effectively, then it kind of doesn't matter. I mean, if you're part of the incident response and investigative forensic sort of process, then of course you want to be very professional, very thorough, and meticulous in how you document all your evidence and how you collected it, how you analyzed it, how you protected the chain of custody, all that kind of stuff, how you arrived at various conclusions and so on. But that's not what your executive suite needs to see usually, right? They need to understand what the business impact is and what both the short and kind of long-term implications are of what happened.
Yeah, you're absolutely correct when you say that people focus on the technicality. I totally relate. I used to do like a lot of the communications around like pen testing reporting, for example. So this is like you mentioned, the meticulous report. But then it's when you're presenting to someone that needs to sign off on it from a project point of view that isn't a security person, like probably a project manager, like you need to convey the top points. Would you say that most people kind of miss the mark when it comes to that? Because of course, getting all of those details are important, but then it's that next level above of we've communicated all of the things that have happened and the event in quite explicit detail, but then the communication and going to an executive, it's still quite not there in terms of people are missing the mark. And I kind of get it. I do understand. But then, of course, it creates that Chinese whispers that think the things weren't communicated that needs to be potentially.
Yeah, I think that one of the consistent problems that I see related to incident reporting or forensic reporting really is trying to use a sort of one-size-fits-all approach to packaging the information, even if you need to present it to different sorts of audiences or different parties. And so that typically leads to way too much technical detail in most cases in the report, right? And it makes it really hard for different categories of what I call consumers, really, of your deliverable to quickly pull out kind of the most salient points for their particular business purposes. So I think that's where a lot of folks are missing the mark. And I mean, I get why it happens, because there's certainly a lot more complexity in today's environments than in years and decades past, right? Where you have critical business systems or functions that are relying on SaaS platforms or platform as a service platforms or some kind of hybrid cloud service models. So you have a lot more actors in the mix, and you have to kind of coordinate and make sure you have good communication between internal teams and external teams, and making sure that you have all of the moving parts and the parties involved moving in the same direction, particularly under the stress of an actual event, right? And where you have really time sensitive things happening, and you in terms of doing the investigation and responding to and recovering from incidents and so on. But it's really that coordination and communication between various teams, whether they're internal or external, that I think is critical, not only for reporting, but also forms the backbone, really, or makes the difference between what's a successful response that is merely a bump in the road for your company versus something that turns out to be a catastrophic incident, right? And I think part of that too is making sure that you understand ahead of time what information you need to collect and how you need to present it under various circumstances or in different contexts. Uh, you have also, I mean, going back to my previous point around how there's so much complexity now with a lot of external service providers and so on as part of the investigative and forensic process, you need to make sure that you and they are really clear on where the boundaries of responsibility are around what you as an organization or company do security wise and investigation wise, and what your service provider is doing for you, right? A lot of companies, they make assumptions around what the service provider is giving them in terms of security, but those assumptions could be vastly different from what the reality is, right? And you end up during an event, during an incident, going to your service provider and you're in a position of saying, well, I thought you were logging that data, and the service provider says, oh, no, we were only providing you the mechanisms to log that data if you wanted to turn that capability on, right? And so those kinds of things are technical bits that need to be considered early on, but you also need to consider how you're going to consume as an investigative team, how you're going to consume and process that data, and then how you're going to present it back in a usable fashion.
There's a couple of things in there that you said. Loved what you said, by the way. So you mentioned one size fits all. What do you sort of mean by that when you say that?
Yeah, so I guess what I mean by that is that it's all too common for an investigative report being written with all of the technical information in it to support its use in subsequent litigation, that kind of stuff. So it's a really good forensic technical report, but it doesn't get altered in any way. It doesn't get digested, right? Doesn't get processed in any way to present it in a much more concise fashion, or to focus in on specific key points that are important to some audiences and not to other audiences, right? So it's really, when I say one size fits all, what I mean is taking that original technical forensic report and trying to just use that same report for all kinds of different purposes.
Gotcha. So just so I have this right, it's probably like someone using a very stock standard framework / report, and they're trying to apply it to every single incident, for example, but they're not sort of customizing it, or they're not taking things out perhaps that aren't required or necessary. Is that sort of what you mean by that? Just so I got that right.
So, well, that's one aspect of it. So if you are using a particular template or format for your
Mm-hmm.
investigative and forensic reports, right? And you're not maybe changing the structure of your report based on the actual events and the actual facts of the particular incident, then that might be a poor fit. But I think the thing that I'm really talking about is taking a report, even if it's well written and well structured, and just taking that raw report and using it for multiple kinds of consumers, even if that's not the optimal way to present the facts to that consumer.
Totally can understand and relate. Now, the other thing you mentioned before, Ted, was the boundaries and establishing that with vendors. So, how would you go about if you're sitting in a company and you're thinking, oh my gosh, I actually haven't established any boundaries with vendors, and if I've got to obtain information from them that they're supposed to be doing because I made an assumption, how would you sort of go about sort of framing that conversation?
Sure. Well, hopefully you have a really good, you have good relationships with your various vendors and suppliers. And I think it's really as simple as having the conversation with whoever your primary account manager or primary point of contact is with that particular organization, and say, look, we want to make sure that in the event of a security incident, that we are all on the same page in terms of what you can do to help us recover, detect, recover, investigate an incident, and what the process is for contacting you, making sure that it's appropriately escalated as an urgent request, right? Making sure that we have all of the communication plans documented and agreed to ahead of time, and that we understand what data you can provide us in what kind of time frame. If you what kinds of other capabilities you have on your side to help us in our investigation. I think a good example maybe is there was a company in the US a few years ago that literally went from being in business to being out of business in about 8 hours, right? And what happened was that they were like a code repository, version control type of company, force. They had, of course, software companies as their customers, and they had all of their stuff in AWS. And I think they felt one of their administrators was targeted with a phishing attack, and so had credentials stolen to the AWS console. They didn't have two-factor authentication enabled, so that allowed your attacker then to just log in. And basically, they came in to work one morning, and there was a text file that had been dropped, I think, on an administrator's workstation, and it was a ransom demand, right? Letting them know that they had taken over their AWS instances, and that they needed to get paid, or else they were going to start destroying data. And so the company decided, well, as a first order of business, we're just going to change all administrative passwords. The attackers, of course, had already created multiple accounts for themselves that allowed them back into the environment. And they were able to get into the environment and delete everything, including, by the way, all of the backups, because the backups were also stored in AWS with the same credentials and so on, right? Not in a separate VPC or anything like that. So, this company went out of business like in 8 hours because they had lost all of the source code for all of their customers. Uh, and part of the problem is that they made certain assumptions about what AWS was providing in terms of security, right? They didn't really understand how AWS could have helped them in this situation, right? Like if before they had decided to change administrative passwords, if they had called up AWS and said, "Can you please help us by snapshotting everything, right, and moving some stuff off, or something like that," or if they had understood that there were other types of protections available to them, if they had turned on multi-factor authentication and so on, these things could have been prevented, right? Or they would have had a much better shot at coming out okay on the other end of this thing. So, so I think that part of it is having that upfront communication and conversation with your vendor through your primary point of contact, whether that's an account manager or whatever. But then really getting down to brass tacks with some of the technical folks on the other side, so that everybody knows way ahead of time if there is an incident, if there's an event, what the plan is and how all of the moving pieces of the investigation are going to work.
You explaining that story, my stress and anxiety, that is crazy and wild. I feel so bad for those guys. That's terrible. Oh my gosh. But I can absolutely understand when you're saying that there's that disconnect, right? Like, oh, I thought you guys were doing that. Oh, I thought you were doing that. So that happens. Would you say, maybe not that scenario specifically, but that type of miscommunication on who's doing what happens more often than not, and more often than people realize, perhaps?
Yeah, I think that folks sign up for it. Well, okay, this goes back to my. It depends on the organization and how big it is and how mature it is, right? So, you've got really large organizations who have a super rigorous and potentially even painful kind of procurement process where they really vet or try to really vet their vendors and their security capabilities and nail down SLAs and metrics, all that kind of thing. Um, but then you also have at the other end of the spectrum very small organizations that they know they need help. They need to outsource their IT operations or whatever because they sell shoes or whatever their actual business is. They're not in the business of IT, and so they kind of outsource. They often pick just on price. They don't necessarily have the in-house expertise to really pick the right service set, and so they are again making assumptions about what's really being provided and what's not. And then somewhere in the middle, you've got your medium-sized companies or companies that are maybe larger but not terribly sophisticated or mature, that are kind of somewhere on that spectrum, right? Who are making some assumptions on what the vendor is providing, maybe haven't nailed down specific key performance indicators and SLAs, and don't have a really good understanding of what they're getting. I guess one of the analogies I like to use when talking about this is really it's like at a shopping mall where if you have a store in a shopping mall, okay, you sign an agreement with the landlord, the owner of the mall, and they're going to provide you with certain things, right? They provide lighting in the parking garage and or the parking lot. They might provide security guards who walk around the common areas of the mall. They provide fire suppression, fire detection, right? Those kinds of things. But when it comes to actually preventing people from stealing things inside your store, that's your issue, right? That's your responsibility. Or making sure that you have good hiring practices, or that you can investigate employee theft, that kind of thing. That's your responsibility, right? And you shouldn't be relying on the service provider or the landlord in this case to cover those things for you. And so it's really important to understand what's in your bucket of things, of responsibilities, and what's not.
Absolutely, and you're so right. I really like the analogy that you use, and I still think there needs to be some room for improvement, because this podcast is obviously dedicated to not just CISOs or CTOs, it's all types of executives that need to understand about cybersecurity. So, Ted, I'd like to sort of switch gears for a second and talk about, so sort of wrap all this conversation up around the digital forensics reporting side of things. So, if I give like a scenario, I want to sort of talk through it because I think this is important, and I haven't had anyone on my show talk about this, and I do want people to really take note of your experience and your thoughts around how to do this accurately. So, if you're an executive and you need to review a digital forensics report, and then you'll need to communicate the high level points to your CEO to then provide an update on this front. So, the update could be to the media, to customers, to internal employees about what's happening. So I want to sort of understand specifically how you'd structure your report and the language that you'd use to then communicate that to executives.
Sure. Yeah. So, I mean, it's really important for you to understand the needs of your particular audience, right? And I like to call it, you need to know for the particular consumer of your deliverable or of your report, what makes their care light illuminate. If you can deliver the most technically detailed and accurate report in the world, but if you can't get the audience to care about it, then you haven't succeeded in your mission. And so part of it is understanding how the recipient is going to need to use the report. If you're going to be giving it to the CTO or the head of network infrastructure, well, they need enough information, technical detail to understand, hey, what failed here? What kind of security measures failed? What needs to be fixed right now, and how do I do it? And then, how do we address this to prevent it from in the future, right? If you're talking to the CFO or providing them with information, they probably want to know, like, what are the hard costs of any downtime that we incurred because of this incident? Do you have estimates about what sort of downstream costs there might be related to things like breach notification or fines for like not complying with regulatory requirements, that sort of thing? Or if you're providing information general counsel, maybe they're most concerned with whether the details of the incident and how it occurred can be used to demonstrate negligence on the part of the company, right? And if there's a way, or maybe they're interested in, hey, can you actually accurately provide me attribution of external actors that we can either litigate against or try to pursue prosecution on. But in terms of structuring the report, though, particularly, let's say for a CEO, of course, you want to have an executive summary up front, right? That is super concise, that really communicates the key points as concisely as possible, because ultimately they're probably going to have to communicate all of that information to the board or others. And so you need to capture the things that are going to make their care light illuminate, right? And I guess the main body of the report really needs to capture or to depict what happened as sort of a broad category event. Was this a breach with the disclosure of sensitive data? Was it denial of service or ransomware or whatever it might be? What was the scope of what happened? Like, which systems were affected? What data got affected? Did it only affect us, or was this maybe a larger kind of attack, a larger incident that affected others in our industry or the internet as a whole or whatever? And then how it happened, but really in very brief kind of terms. Was there a technical failure? And if there was it a failure on our side in one of our systems, or was it somebody else's systems that failed that we kind of were collateral damage in? Was it a process or a procedural problem that made this occur, or was it human error? Just a simple mistake. How did we respond to it? How did we resolve it? Hopefully, we have resolved it at this point. And what was the impact to our company or our organization? Direct impacts like downtime, financial impacts, direct cost, indirect costs, maybe things like reputational impact as well, considering those types of things. Are we going to get sued over this? Is there anybody we can sue over this? Do I need to fire somebody, right? Does our insurance cover this? And how do we prevent this kind of incident from occurring in the future? Have we already started implementing the right kinds of changes to prevent this in the future? And how much is that going to cost, right? The prevention side of things. So I think, right, structuring it in that way covers really the kind of salient things that executives really need to know. And then depending on which executive you're talking to, you might tailor it even further.
Wow, that's excellent. Anyone we can sue, are we being sued? Relevant points. In terms of, so you get an executive summary, this may be hard to answer, but I'm going to ask you anyway. So, people have different versions of an executive summary. As a estimate, how many words would you sort of say? Because I've seen executive summaries that go for 2 or 3 pages. To me, that feels a little long. Maybe I'm wrong, but I'm happy for you to correct me or provide some indication so people know. They may think they're giving a high level exec summary, but in fact, it's super detailed and it lists every single thing that's happened. Because they feel that it's a requirement to talk about that specifically.
Yeah, I think that really, if you're going past a page or maybe a page and a half, right, something like that, you're probably getting too deep into the weeds. If possible, what you should try to do is take items that are related to one another and try to come up with a way to categorize those so that you can clump them together into a single bullet point. And then, in the body of the report, you can give a little more nuance and definition, or delineate some of the kind of contours of that in more depth. But really, I think what you want to give your executive is, here is a couple of sentences about generally what happened. Here are the top 3 to 5 bullet points that you really need to know, and you need to be able to communicate clearly to others, whether that be the board or to external counsel or whomever. Um, and then what we as an organization are doing about it, right, or have done about it in order to to resolve the issue, close the vulnerability that got exploited in the first place, and to prevent these things from happening again, right? I think it's the what happened, how it happened, but not in very much detail, and what are we doing about it.
What about language? Because you've mentioned before that you've got to tailor it. So if you're speaking to a CFO, they talk in financial language, and then if you're speaking to a CTO, they care about technology. How would you go about sort of structuring that? Does the language, will it differ significantly, or what's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, I think that you may. So I'd say that from the executive summary perspective, they might not be that different, although certainly you need to tailor that again to your audience, right? Because that top 3 to 5 bullet points that the consumer cares about may be different depending on the audience. So I do think that, again, it's really knowing what it is that the person you're presenting or you're giving the report to is going to need to have in there to meet their particular business requirements, right? So how are they going to use your product? How are they going to use your report, and then tailor it appropriately? So the language certainly is going to vary depending on whether the intended audience is technical or not. So let's say, again, if you're providing this kind of information to your CEO as the consumer, then you need to understand what's going to turn on his care light. And it's really easy to get caught up in kind of the technical gee whiz sort of aspects if it's a particularly clever exploit or whatever. And sometimes, if you are a tech company and the CEO happens to be super technical because she or he kind of started the company by writing a clever application or whatever, then cool, you can probably go down the rabbit hole with them a bit. But generally speaking, if you're talking to the CEO or you're presenting these facts to the CEO, then you're going to need to really highlight some very specific business facing types of things, right? And highlight not only the what went wrong, like the control failures, but you might also want to highlight like what things did work, what kinds of detection or alerting maybe that happened that worked in order to kick off the investigation in the first place. And that can at least help you to demonstrate the value of some of the investments that you maybe already have put into security solutions, right? But in terms of tailoring things, certainly if you're talking to the CFO, you're going to need to be really talking about costs and return on investment for existing security investments that the organization has made, right? Or if you're talking to internal counsel, looking at things like what is the risk picture and what are the potential pitfalls for the organization in terms of culpability and civil liability and those kinds of things.
Yeah, that's excellent. I really appreciate you sharing that. The other thing I'd like to ask us on that again is, would you say it's a fair assumption to include like ongoing communication? So what I mean by that is, if it's a pretty full on incident and I don't know, maybe it's completely taken everything down, and perhaps there's a note in the executive summary to say every day at 11 a.m. we're going to give updates to the media, to our clients about what's happening. Because I've seen this a lot with incidents, that we've had an incident, this happened, and then we never hear from the company around the continuous communications around what they're doing. And it's sort of like it just goes into a black hole, then all of a sudden everything's back up and running again 5 days later. I still think there's that gap in the communications around this is what we're doing every day, even if there's no update. It's about upward managing, providing an update that we are still working on the problem. Please bear with us while we, get things up and running again. Would you say that's important to note as well?
Sure. So certainly that's part of, I think, a larger question around, is it important to make sure that the entire communication plan as part of or as a subset of your incident response processes is addressed and well understood ahead of time, right? So certainly when you have a really major incident, you're going to be pulling in legal, you're going to be pulling in public relations or media relations and so on. And there's definitely going to be some discussion around how much the organization is willing to provide public commentary or public updates. And that's going to probably vary widely between organizations and even between incidents, quite frankly, within the organization, depending on the kind of data that was affected and the facts of the case, right? If you know going into this, we really made a major mistake here. Legal might want to clamp down on that, right, until they get a better picture of what that means from a liability perspective. And so a lot of that is going to be, we can certainly like recommend or suggest that as we're updating executives or updating senior management. But ultimately, that's probably going to be largely out of the security organization's hands.
Totally understand. Thank you very much for sharing your thoughts. So, just lastly, so we've spoken about what you would include, what you'd sort of do, the language, the structure. What would you intentionally leave out, though, perhaps, that people may be putting in their report that you'd sort of recommend that they perhaps just leave it off?
Sure. Yeah. So anything anything that I think you couldn't explain um, to a non-technical person within 2 or 3 sentences, right? So it's all of, as I said before, it's really easy to kind of get enamored of the technical details of how this thing occurred because it was particularly clever or whatever. But you need to consider whether the material that you put into the report provides value or not to its intended consumer. So, really for not just for digital forensics, but quite frankly, for any sort of business documents you create, right? Why am I writing this particular sentence? Am I actually adding anything of value to my deliverable by putting this sentence into this document, right? And if you think about the context of how it's going to be used by a particular audience, if the answer isn't yes, then you probably don't need to put it in the document.
Absolutely right. No, you're so right. And I was going to ask, like, how would you sort of define value? But I think you sort of answer that, because again, if it's not needed or someone's not going to read it, you probably don't need it. And so I think that those are a really good way, easy way to self-assess when you're writing stuff. I probably don't need to put this in. So I've absolutely enjoyed this chat today. I think you've given really, really good insights, information on this stuff, because again, I feel like this is definitely an area that does need improvement. It's not an easy thing to do. I want to just caveat that and say this type of report writing, to then communicate that to other people that don't understand the incident at the sort of specific details, this is a hard thing to do. So I really do appreciate you getting into the nuts and bolts of things, because I wanted to sort of pull that apart so people can take stuff away from this interview that they can implement today, that they are doing wrong. Perhaps they are writing things in their reports that they shouldn't be. So I really, really appreciate your thoughts and your time, Ted. If people perhaps have a question that I didn't ask you today, even though I asked you like 1,000, how can they go about getting in contact with you?
Sure. So I'm happy to answer questions. They can email me at ted@Positroniq, Positroniq.com.
Wonderful. Well, thanks again, Ted. I really appreciate you coming on the show, and I can't wait to get you back.
Great. Thank you very much, Chris. I appreciate it.
Thanks for tuning in. We hope that you found today's episode useful and you took away a few key points. Don't forget to subscribe to our podcast to get our latest episodes. If you'd like to find out how KBI can help grow your cyber business, then please head over to kbi.digital.
This podcast was brought to you by KBI.media, the voice of cyber.